Welcome to the panel discussion on middleware. Just in case we don't know or agree or would like to know what middleware is, there is going to be a presentation on authentication and authorization infrastructure, which is one of the things that make up the middleware area. So we can sort of kind of agree on terminology. And to make that introduction is one of the architects behind the switch authentication and authorization infrastructure, Christoph Graf. He's been working together with other people to build a solution for higher education in Switzerland. To make that introduction, he's been working with Switch for a number of years. One of the architects behind the Switch. All kinds of interesting services, including middleware, but also more application services and security together with other people. Please, Christoph, a solution for higher education. To make that introduction, he's been working with Switch for a number of years.
Also working for Ingrid now, and so on.
All kinds of interesting services, including middleware.
He is working, and what is his Frank, please. Well, introduce Frank Capello.
Okay, thanks for the
working
opportunity to present
University
AI.
of
I would like to go back.
also working for Ingrid now, and so on. Well, he is
Including
working, and Frank, please.
But this wasn't running was poison. Okay, thanks for the way to present AI. Those developing the courses have to make sure that go back.
Also working for Ingrid now, and so on.
The government way of course was
Sorry for that. Today we'll try to discuss about the problem of executive cloud application.
done about that. And we called some universities together.
So I am from the Paris, and I also made this project
Actually, we do have a nice working relationship between universities. For instance, they accept degrees and so on. And we thought actually on the electronic side of things, the same thing is division. Actually, we do have a working
but I will briefly make an introduction describing Ingrid and Tveter. And then I will discuss about two main points
the organization. Actually, on the first point of things, how we organize the using. One of the cornerstones is what we called an authentication and authorization infrastructure. We dubbed it AAI. Well, it's not very imaginative, but whatever abbreviation you come up with in the first place, it stays forever. So, and you can see that the roadmap which was laid out by this group, it's not something you build in 1 or 2 years. It takes longer. And amazingly enough, this is basically what was this group was coming up with in the year 2000, and we are now here, and we intend to stay and to stick with this plan, more or less. So a couple of slides about the problem we try to solve. So a user wants to access a resource. This resource is owned by someone, and we assume that this someone is not going to allow everybody to access this resource. So what can the resource owner do? What you usually do is you ask the user to authenticate himself in a way. One way of doing it is you ask this person for some ID, maybe a passport or whatever it is. Maybe more appropriate would be a student card in this context here. Some information about the user is stored, and in order for the next time the user comes by, you don't have to go through the same process. You handle out some credentials, so usually username and password. One resource, one user one organization, basically no problem. But in a slightly different setting, which is more to what we are used to, you don't have not only one organization, but maybe you would like to access a course at a different university. And this is exactly what we try to do here, because it's about distance learning courses offered by another university. Assuming this user is from the University of Zurich, well, Lausanne is a nice town. You might go there and present yourself, show your passport, whatever. You get another set of credentials. Same thing maybe in the case of Geneva. Nice town too, but you don't want to travel all along Switzerland, so maybe you try the postal way. But in the end, you pile up all those credentials. And I like the analogy. It really looks like piling up Post-it notes on your screen. It looks like that, and basically this is what happens usually. Of course, it's more complicated because you've got the same problem all over the country in this case, or all over the world if you look in a little bit larger scale. Many users, many resources, many organizations, this definitely is a problem. We then try to develop a model on how to attack this problem. We've seen in the slide before that you need to register in some way. There is one natural way where you have to register anyway. This is your home organization. In the case of a student, it's the university where the student is registered. So this is a step. It happens anyway. This is being done. The user has to present himself, give some documentation. So to be allowed to the university, this happens. And the information is stored in a database with the home organization only. On the resource side, what we think should happen is that the resource owner wants to have some access control over the resource in some way, and wants to define a policy which has to be applied in some way. What he did on the earlier slide is register each and every student to see whether he matches his policy or not. But we think we are only interested in this policy. So something saying like any student from any university, a student from this and that faculty, allowing that range of universities, something like that. And that's it. The resource should not deal with individual users and have to register them. This is kind of the preconditions. Now the case when a user from this home organization, regardless where he is, wants to access a resource, tries to access, well, the first thing usually carried out, it could also be the second phase, it doesn't really matter too much. The user authenticates with the only place which can do that. This is the home organization. And the means, it doesn't matter. It's up to the home organization to define the methods they use to do that. So this is the only place where the user gets authenticated. Once this step has been done, it's no longer an anonymous user. It's a user known at least to the home organization. Now this user tries to access the resource. The resource or the access control manager on the other side wants to know a little bit about the user, because we assume the resource is not just open to everybody. So the resource owner is going to ask, or the access control manager is going to ask the home organization, the only place knowing something about the user, about some attributes. The resource owner gets the answer from the home organization. Maybe it fulfills the policy, maybe it doesn't. And dependent on the outcome, the user will get access to the resource or being denied. Maybe you noticed there are only two A's in our project name, authentication and authorization. Usually there is a third one, accounting, and we deliberately left it out. And for, I think, pretty good reasons. One of them is that a third A makes the whole thing much, much more complicated. For instance, the home organization must be in a position to say yes or no to such a request. And this has to be done online, very tricky business. So what we say is, if there is money flowing, it somehow needs that something has been set up between the resource owner and the home organization, and you can do that very well offline, beforehand, in whichever way you want to do that. And you're helped because you get the logs from the authentication on this side, on the side of the home organization. You got logs on the side of the resource owner. And you need some type of bilateral agreement to get it solved. In the future, we might extend the infrastructure to also cover accounting, but first we want to see in which real case it does make sense. We don't want to solve it just because there are cool tools around. That's not what we want to do. There are lots of advantages in using such an infrastructure. We noted some of them. So virtual mobility, where you stay where you are and you visit other locations over the network. This is a setting we are looking at primarily. You need something like that. It simply otherwise doesn't scale well. Information protection. If you get, as a resource owner, good tools to protect your resource, you're probably going to do it. If you have very bad tools, you're probably not doing it properly. You try to cheat a little bit. So if this AAI really works, resource owners will do proper information protection. So information protection gains from the whole thing. Remote access. In today's world, lots is being done on looking at IP addresses, and with the AI, this is a thing of the past. And it helps lots of people to really solve the problem of remote access. Think at libraries. What they do today is they look at IP addresses. If you work from home, it doesn't work. Then you have to find some dirty workarounds like VPNs and stuff like that to somehow map yourself back into the IP range. But it's not more than a dirty workaround. What you would like to see is to be done it properly, and we hope to do it properly that way. User friendliness. You've seen the pile of user credentials or the post-it pile on the screen, which is not really user friendly. And since you're only faced with one way of authenticating, this is the way which is being done at your home organization. You don't have to deal with any other technology, whatever, of any other site you're not familiar with. So user friendliness definitely gains here. IT efficiency. All universities are faced with the same problem. We can work together, cooperate, and I think we get a much more efficient use of resources that way. Administrative overhead is an issue. If you think that when users when virtual mobility really takes off, then you will visit courses at many universities. And at those universities, you have to get registered in some way. As long as it is probably today, it's only a relatively small percentage of users really visiting other campuses on a regular basis. We're talking about several percents at this moment. So the administrative overhead is something like several percents. This one loses, of course, as well. But if it really takes off, and it's a usual thing to have in your curriculum that you have to go to different campuses on a virtual basis, then this really gets a problem. Last but not least, if users do not feel happy, you get an image problem in the end, and it certainly is a good idea to look into that at a relatively early stage. To get an idea of what the attributes are you want to ship over the wire between home organization and resource owner, we defined a set. The red ones are the ones which we think are mandatory to take part in the AAI. It's nothing really fancy. It's a persistent unique identifier, which has been mentioned several times these days. Surname, given name, that's the person attributes, and some group membership attributes related to your home organization, the type of your home organization, and what your affiliation is. This is it basically. This is what we want to start with. We defined some other attributes which we thought might come into the play, maybe not in the beginning, but at a later stage. And it's definitely a good idea for the universities to look into them, how they can provide them. But in the beginning, it's not likely that they are being used in large scale. We tried to base those attributes on existing standards. We took some of them from EduPerson and another set from something very Switzerland-specific. It's elements which are used for statistical purposes, so the universities know them already, but this is definitely something which is very local of scope. This slide is to kind of put our AI into context. Actually, it's interesting. So far, I never talked about the product we are going to use to implement the AI. And in the process, this is something we only decided very, very late. So we defined attributes, the model, and all that stuff without the specific architecture in mind. Early this year, we decided to go for Shibboleth. And those are the important things about it. So the trust model really fits very well. And an interesting property is that in our community, users usually are registered with exactly one home organization. It's the university they are enrolled in. They keep the records. ECTS is one of those keywords, the European Credit Transfer System. One organization has to look after them. So this model really fits well. MS Passport is something we did not look into because we thought it definitely does not fit our needs. It's not a federated model, at least not at the moment. Another interesting thing is the Liberty Alliance. They do basically the same thing as Shibboleth, but one interesting thing which is a difference is that you register with more than one home organization if you use the same terminology, and the identity is kind of the sum of all of them makes up your identity. If you try to do the same thing with Shibboleth, then you end up with multiple identities. Something you probably can live with at the moment. But if we move out of our academic community and commercial players come into the picture, then we probably have to move in that direction. But we think we went for the right solution, since the people working on Shibboleth are also working in the Liberty Alliance, and we think maybe it's going to merge in some way in the future. We'll have to see that. So that's it from my part.
Are there any questions? I'll let the members of the panel come up and take their seats and then take questions. Question from David. Wait for the microphone, please. Oh, someone was going. Sorry.
Okay, this is a question to Christoph, which I've actually given to him privately before, so he already knows it. But it's to do with decision making and the fact that what you do is transport the attributes, but don't actually make decisions based on them, which is like a number of systems, like Shibboleth, for example. What are you proposing to do in that area in the longer term?
Actually, we did not look too much into that. We start with this model, and we will have to see what the user interfaces are to manage the policies, which are in force in many places here. But we don't really know the requirements yet. We first have to see some resources using that infrastructure before we really see what we need. So first we play around with it. Maybe we use some fixed attributes in the beginning and take it from there.
Any other questions? Then let me move on to introducing the other members of the panel. From my left is, on the extreme left, is the legal advisor to the Tveter project in Norway, Walter Martin Tveter, who's working at the Center for Information Technology at the University of Oslo. And then there's Ken Klingenstein, who's the Middleware coordinator for Internet 2. Is that as close as it gets? Harald Alvestrand, who's the chair of the ITF, and he used to work with a real national research network way back. That's it. Any comments from you on the presentation?
Just to follow up on David's comment, once you get SAML, then there's languages close by like XACML, which are fairly tempting for the Auth-Z space, but that's, at least in our conversations, that's still a very open issue. But there is a fit there that should be acknowledged.
I was encouraged to see that you have a definition of middleware that limited yourself to authentication and authorization infrastructures, which I think is a good thing, because, you know, middleware has been used in very many different ways, and lots of these ways have big problems. So I'm glad that we are limiting the discussion.
Does that mean authentication and authorization does not have big problems?
No.
Are there any other comments? If not, I'd like to ask Walter a question about privacy and the need for persistent personal identifiers. As we saw, the switch system uses persistent anonymous identifiers. Can you comment on the use of those?
Well, I think that if you want to use a system like this for a long time, it would be a problem not to have persistent identifiers. A lot of people are afraid of them because they feel that they're a threat to privacy, but I think the real threat to privacy in that context would be to have something else so that you can't identify people. If that answered your question? No. No. Why? Because privacy in that context is about not revealing information about an individual, not about not identifying that individual with an ID. And if you use ununique identifiers, then you can end up in a situation where you're not really sure who did something. And that's worse than knowing too much. Yeah.
There's a terminology issue here that's real important. Any persistent identifier becomes less than anonymous over time. So I think we need to talk about two types of persistent identifiers. One, the persistent, meaningless but unique number, and then the short-term identifiers, which may be used for web sessions or some other kind of short-term activity. And it's only by relying on those very short-term identifiers for individual transactions or individual web-based access that you can gain real anonymity, because those things are not persistent, and so we can't notice that, gee, the same persistent identifier goes to these following locations and derive identity from that.
Would 2304693512 be a meaningless or a meaningful number?
Over time it can become very meaningful, because one notices the pattern of what attributes get associated with that meaningless number, and it's no longer meaningless.
And is that more or less dangerous than the fact that the Norwegians in the audience will notice that I'm born on the 23rd of April 1969 and I'm a female, which I just told you by giving you a meaningless number?
Well, I want to support Walter's comment that the way to privacy is through a persistent, opaque identifier. It's only by managing privacy in an active fashion that we can really get privacy. That said, I would learn over time much more about that persistent identifier date of birth. I believe with data mining, almost any person can be identified fairly easily after a number of transactions, even with an anonymous identifier. I assume that that happens all the time. I think you ought to assume that too.
Ton in the
Yeah,
back.
can I comment on the distinction between short-lived and long-lived persistent identifiers? We have an application in Holland where that's a web shop where you can order and license software. And one of the rules says that you can only order, for example, Windows XP only once as a user. So over the lifetime of Windows XP being available, you need a long-lived, probably, unique persistent ID. The alternative is, of course, that the resource provider or the home institution is going to include an entitlement or negative entitlement, already downloaded XP, but that's not really manageable, I'm afraid. So I can imagine there are applications that need a long-lived, persistent, unique identifier.
One of the things with identifiers is that whether they're random or not often depends on how much the person who looks at them knows. So Ken didn't know that what Ingrid was saying was a Norwegian person number, which gives you additional data. And one of the big threats to privacy is that we tend to give away additional data without thinking about it. For instance, giving away our date of birth, well, because we want to assert that we are a unique individual. Now, in my culture, men are generally don't want to lie about their ages, but others might be different. So to assert some control of what information we choose to share with others, I think that's a good goal. It's not an easy one.
Keith in the back.
I don't suspect it's a coincidence that in a country where governmental state respect for privacy is declining as rapidly as anywhere in the world, that concern for privacy on the part of the citizens is increasing. I'm speaking for myself here. I think what I would say, though, about persistent identifiers and the management of privacy around that essentially comes back because you've all given very good reasons why we do need to share these between an origin and a target conceptually. It puts more of an implicit burden of stewardship on both of those organizations to manage that traffic is not visible between the two, and that the identifiers and other information isn't leaked out to other sources who don't have a valid reason to see that information, and then start building click trails based on those persistent identifiers. So all I just want to say is that this underlines the responsibilities of the parties at either end to protect the privacy, since we can't avoid using persistence.
Oh, can I use it along the way? I think the interesting follow-up question then is, when do the persistent, opaque, unique identifiers need to pass between federations versus staying as a federated activity, so that Ingrid can decide whatever that opaque number is that makes sense for her federation, etc., and whether or not the only kinds of identifiers that will pass between federations are those that are session-based, rather relatively short-termed, and that might be one of the boundary conditions that help determine the federation architecture over time. Don't know, but it's certainly worth a thought.
To what you said, if I had not lived in Europe, I would agree with you a lot. But I'm not really scared that some company in Europe is going to find out a lot of personal data about me because of a lack of technical means for hindering that, because we have laws that try to make it unwise for companies to do that. You hit them with laws that said that if you do this, then you're probably going to lose money. Also in Europe, we have this relationship where we trust the other actor in society, the governments, and thus you're sort of safe on both ends. And the problem is when you have somewhere where you can't control the companies and you don't trust the government.
Amen.
Now, the story that I was thinking of a few moments ago became relevant again. This was a story from the introduction of the SET payment system that Visa and MasterCard designed in the US. SET was designed around the theory that if you provide the customer with electronic smart cards, and then they don't have to give away credit card numbers anymore. Wonderful. Except for one little detail, that you had the shopkeepers like to keep records of what their customers are doing because they are doing profiling all over the place. And guess what they were using as identifiers for the customers? The credit card number. And of course, this wasn't available in the SET transaction. Now, one of the promises that the credit card companies had made to the customer when introducing SET was that the shop would not be able to profile you because he's not being given personal information about you, so he can't track you. But when the shopkeepers came around and said, we need tracking information, they broke the promise to the customer and added to the return information from the credit card company to the vendor. You guessed it, the credit card number. I think that if we figure out that the system needs permanent identifiers for the entities identified, that might be okay. Although I'm not as sanguine about profiling as my friend over to the left, even though we live in the same country. I suspect that we're politically, we might be positioned at the wrong end of the table.
You said extreme left. I was surprised that the lawyer was...
But if we design a system and give guarantees to the users and then break those guarantees, we are breaking trust. And that's a lot harder to rebuild than systems, actually.
I have a question. If we have only short-lived identifiers, one thing is we know how to live with federations and handle authentication, but identity management is more than just authentication. If you want to collate information about a person from multiple sources and you only have short-lived identifiers between federations, then you can't collate information that lives in different federations, right? No? Please.
You can always, we have questions a lot about how do we preserve state when we're changing identifiers so rapidly, and the answer to a content provider is that they have the freedom to drop an attribute or something else back into the home user's directory that could be used for state purposes and tracking purposes. So I think the question really is, do you do that kind of activity on a pairwise basis, or do you provide a globally unique opaque number that everybody can use? And the answer probably depends upon what problem you're looking at and whether scaling or security and privacy is the more important issue. But there is a different way to skin that cat, which is just pairwise tracking mechanisms that can be placed in. Skin the cat.
Does that scale? Because what you're saying is if you allow other people to store information about your users in your home organization, then you don't have to pass out the... So the price you pay for being able to protect parts of your user's identity is giving them right access so they can write information into your systems.
Presumably for...
My security vibes are going scary.
Presumably you set up a batch process to handle that and apply security. You don't give them LDAP rights directly into the directory.
Okay. Are there other attributes about persons apart from unique numbers? EduPerson, for instance, has UID at whatever institution you're at. And since I gave you my national identity number, I may as well give you my EduPerson principal name, which is iam@uninett.no, which also gives out additional information about me. It gives out my username, and it gives out the institution I'm at. And if I'd handed out the number I handed out earlier, you wouldn't know where I was. Is that good or bad?
Both. I think that depends on what you use it for. If you just hand out this number that we've been talking about that doesn't say anything about you except for which sex you have and when you were born, that's fine unless someone starts to make a profile. But in the other context where you just give out Ingrid Melve at UNINETT, then you have an ID that is probably making the information about you less updated. You can see privacy in many ways, and I think that it's bad if you can't have a central place to update this. And I think that those kinds of IDs would hinder that. Again, I don't think not getting message across.
I was thinking about one thing about identifiers that give auxiliary information is that they need to change for obvious reasons. I use an email address called Harald at Alvestrand.no. I've kept that alive through three different employers and about 3 million spam messages. Then the reason I use it is that it's an identifier that's relatively stable under most of the pressures that usually make identifiers like that change. So I made an investment in systems that I run purely because I want this identifier to be stable. But not everyone is in a position to make that investment. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, I'd like to look at the problem from a slightly different angle, and that is that the unique identifier, if it's not the only one that you have, but you can actually have multiple ones of them and you change them with time, then if we think in the real world, the people who only actually change their names are really criminals who go under pseudonyms, etc., to perform criminal acts. And none of the people in this room... Sorry? Let me continue.
Or men who get married.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, that's a recognised one. But generally speaking, people don't change their identifiers. Now, if we move to the digital world and we actually have this ability for people to have multiple identifiers and the ability to switch them, then if you actually trust one identifier and start to have a relationship, but then the trust fails, then you would not want to deal with that person or that identity again. But then if the person has the ability to just keep switching identities, then it does actually introduce the ability for criminals to actually operate more freely. I'm just looking at it from the other perspective, the ability that the identifier is never actually pinned to one person, and it's the only identifier, but they have multiple ones. So I'd just like the panel to comment on that.
You just headed down an extremely dangerous path, which is the concept of, if I behave in ways that are unusual, I can be assumed to be a criminal. No, that was the way I was looking at it, sorry. That was why I said it was headed down at you. You might not have hit the bottom of that slippery slope yet. It's a big ocean down there. It's full of tar.
What I'm saying is it allows the criminals to exploit that capability.
Yes, and the reason why this loophole must not be closed, in my opinion, and the reason why right-thinking people should exercise the right to change identifiers, is that under certain circumstances it's a legitimate thing to do. And just as I think we should routinely encrypt mail, if we don't assert the right to do so as routine, then that exact argument will be used to take the last remains of our privacy away from us.
Just to clarify, he did change his name when he married. So the comment about only criminals changing their names, I think you might actually have hit on something.
And then back to his email alias for life, I think there's two relevant quotes. One from Butler Lampson, which is, there is no problem in computer science that cannot be solved with another level of indirection. And the other is from someone named Harald Alvestrand, and its uniqueness is highly overrated.
But actually, David, what you're taking up two very interesting issues. One is the concept of being able to change identities or not change identities. One of the things that the Tveter project has done is support for having multiple identities, because you can actually have the opportunity to be different people at different times, sort of, kind of. The other one is, who do you check the identity with? Because having different identities is not difficult. All of us get spam every day. Some of us get more than 100, some get less. And that's things that are coming from people we don't check the identity. So if we can actually check the identity with someone who vouches for the user, which is what most of the AA infrastructures are doing, they're setting up a organization of some kind that actually vouches for the user, saying, this user belongs to me, this is my user, I can tell you more about him if you're privileged to know that information. And that touches on the issue of, are we dealing with organizations or are we dealing with individuals? Because dealing with individuals has some complexities, some scaling issues that you can avoid by dealing with organizations. But then again, dealing with organizations introduces other interesting aspects. Any comments on that? Was there a hand going up in back?
I just have a question for Walter. It's something I've been wondering. If somebody gets a hold of my personal number and my user account, what can they do? What is the worst they can do to me?
That, again, depends on what is the worst they can do to you inside the law, or if they're criminals. And I think the answer to both questions would be not much that they couldn't do with any other way of identifying you, and a bit more time for doing it, really.
Does that include filing her taxes and...
In that context, the personal identity numbers in Norway are widely mistaken for being something that you can prove your identity with, instead of just being a unique ID. So it is true that you have had examples of someone trying to withdraw money from the bank and they don't have any ID papers and they use this number instead, but that would be the bank's problem and not yours.
Okay, so if we do authentication and really check the identity of people, we're having less problems with all these identifiers flying around than if we just assume things.
I did not understand.
A lot of times we get a number or something. In the US, you are usually asked for your mother's maiden name, which is a kind of a password that will give you access to anything, which really surprised me because no one else in the US knew my mother's maiden name, but as long as I plotted in something, it happily gave me access to all the systems I wanted, which was kind of surprising. So you don't really know, do you need to know your mother's maiden name, you just need to type something. And we have been using the national identity numbers as sort of kind of a password that gives you access. And what we're talking about is instead of just giving something, you actually check to see if that something you're giving is valid. And some of what you're saying, from what you said, I understood that that's actually changing the implications and the rules of the social game we're playing, because it changes the nature of the string. It isn't a password anymore, it's just a token.
Well, it has never been a password, but it has been presumed to be a password. And the more you spread it around, the fewer people are going to think of it as a password. So, I mean, shout it out and then no one's going to get your money.
Can someone get my debts and my mortgage?
Identifiers identify lots of stuff. I had a list of the people in my son's class with the telephone number. Well, I also had the online telephone directory which gave me lookup on telephone number. Now I had to figure out what is the name of the person who is the two persons who are living as father and mother to this child. It took me about 3 seconds to find out.
There's a question.
Yes. Can I ask a completely different question, which to help myself? But in a previous life, I worked in a university administration, and what I see as the proposal here is that universities and other organisations will maintain an administrative system which is part of the wider picture. And it does seem to me that a lot of the questions which have been raised, which are valid questions, but some of them may turn out to be less important in practice, and others of them will give people sleepless nights. And the question I really wanted to ask is, when are we going to see these systems rolled out in substantial numbers? By which year will 50% of all universities, for example, have rolled out AA, or whatever you like to call it?
Well, we expect this to happen within 1 year, or slightly more next year. In Switzerland, yes.
Do you want to answer the Tveter one, or should I take that one? In Norway, we expect to have not 50% of the university. Well, we expect to have all the universities by next summer, and then the university colleges coming on. So we'll have more than 50% of the users by the end of the year, which is really scary. And then there are other people here from other Sweden. Roland, do you have any numbers of it, or Torbjörn? Torbjörn doesn't have number for Sweden. Who else do I know of who's rolling out systems? In the US, when do you expect?
Never. We don't have the same degree of ability to nurture or enforce standards. I think we're doing at it more from the in seduction side, that vendors are saying, gee, if you operate these sets of services. I think what you've heard about in the last few days is a constructionist approach where you set a table, suggest people use these attributes, suggest people use these transports, and pray. I think because it solves a lot of problems that people will buy into some of this. Few people will buy into all of it. But I think in particular that there's, going back to the university administrative systems, there are now 2 or 3 places in the U.S. which have built a centralized authorization system that in turn feeds authorization into the major legacy apps that you used to operate. I think as word about that gets out, as the tools become more general, we'll begin to see campuses begin to invest in their own authorization servers. But even there, what we'll suggest is a recipe and a primitive set of tools that are largely group editors, because I think it comes down to group membership frequently as the blunt tool that we use to implement authorizations and roles. And then we'll start to see, I think, more campuses move to that, but only at the speed that the legacy apps can accommodate being informed about authorization versus spitting it out.
About 30% of the population is unfaithful if they're living in a stable relationship. So if he says he won't reach 50%, that tallies with the seduction remark earlier. Ton in the back.
I'd like to follow up on the previous question and the issue of seduction versus the obligation. I'd like to get a bit more feeling from the room what people see as drivers, or if you will, argumentation, motivation for doing these kind of things in an administrative environment first, and then having it all the way in virtual organizations and what have you, federations. Any ideas from the room?
Paul?
Tan, I think it's going to come from 2 different directions. I am in the room. I think it's going to come from new applications that have never had authorization before that need it, like the file sharing systems, like perhaps video conferencing on a stream basis, not on a per packet QoS, dare I say, a diff serve level. So I think those will start to look for authorization engines that are almost external to themselves, and that's where I think work like Spock P comes in. I think this other goal of getting the legacy systems to externalize their authorization is a lot harder and is going to take a lot longer, just because the legacy systems are the dog and we are the tail.
Ton again.
But will that be convincing for the central ITs to have to do all the efforts for putting up enterprise directories, connecting it into federations, whatever? I mean, you say that's a nice application for users, but will the force of those users, the voice of those users, be strong enough to convince, let's say, central IT departments? I'd like to hear more ammunition.
If they're given the choice between doing that and doing PKI and doing their own portals, probably. There was first a comment from Isabel, then there's Torbjörn, and then Harald.
I just wanted to say that it depends, because you have the administration at the university. You have to work with them to make them understand that pure data is easier for them to work with. They don't have to have replicas of everything. When a student say, I am that person, they can have that information just once. They don't have to to look in a lot of different systems. That's one thing. The other thing is the IT department, and of course the third is the students. And I think like we have now today, yesterday we was setting up something called the Vortex, that is the writable web. That's one of the things that use the Tveter logon and the Tveter names, and that is one of the things that make it easier for the students and also for the other one that needs to write something but don't know how to write HTML.
I think the driver is that we have to be more efficient in doing IT. We have to motivate the benefits of doing things, and we can't afford to maintain full-scale authorization and authentication systems for each application. That's completely unrealistic.
I want to raise a concern on a different level. A lot of the stuff that is really new on the networks today is being driven by users directly, and they regard central IT staff not as tools that can help them work, but as obstacles to be routed around. File sharing, P2P, the chat networks of a few years ago until AOL got into the game are just a few examples. I'm worried that we might actually be creating, investing huge effort in something that will become as obsolete as the mainframe in the PC age. Well, the mainframe has always been there and is apparently making a rebound these days, but it used to be that you can say mainframe and obsolete in the same sentence. I mean it. I'm worried that we're designing authentication and authorization infrastructures that automatically assume by the very design that a small project costs $1 million, and that we make a system that is useless for anything that is so small that one individual can actually do it. And that worries me.
There was a question and then...
The point I wanted to raise was in terms of scalability. Once you have these systems in place where an administration is starting to allocate attributes to people, to make it much more dynamic and responsive and to get around the point that Harald made about computer centers being the bottleneck, we now need to move on to dynamic systems where we can have dynamic delegation and whereby departmental heads can allocate tokens to their staff, and even the project manager can then allocate tokens, and we can have nested hierarchies of delegation of trust. And I'd like to ask the panel if they've considered those issues and thought about putting them into their models at all.
Maybe, let me get back to Harald's, and then I share his concern that we've got a very enterprise mentality here, but we do. And as long as the enterprise hands out lots of resources, it's going to have a dominant say over how those resources get used. And so I think this model has lots of value, but it's not the only model we need. We need some kind of mechanism to accommodate the grossest peer-to-peer. I mean that in both senses of the word. And I think that peer-to-peer activity will in turn be overlaid over different trust fabrics. I think you're going to see P2P apps that are overlaid over federations and enterprises and have legitimate use and will derive trust and authentication and authorization from that. You'll see some that will need something that is more global and may ultimately resort to a PKI. And those will only be in those instances where there's enough at stake for you to get rooted into some kind of global trust fabric. There will be a lot of P2Ps that will use aliases and webs of trust and all those other things. and those will proceed autonomously. So I think the chaos will exist atop 3 different trust fabrics, and the most chaotic activities will exist on the trust fabric of nothingness, and the other 2 will exploit either enterprises federated or global hierarchies as seen as needed. When people become more aware of the dangers of P2P, I'm not dissing P2P, but as we know, it can move viruses, and it should have moved a lot more viruses than it has. We're sloppy in our contamination approaches. When people understand the dangers of P2P, there will become 2 kind of broad P2P environments, one which are anchored in trust and one that continues to live dangerously.
A bit like people. You want to comment?
Well, the worry I have is based on some real situations. In a basement down at UNINETT in Trondheim, there's a box that I run. And the principal administrator of that one has got a Tveit identity, I'll bet. There's another administrator who lives in Florida. He's a university professor, so he could probably tie into one of Ken's pilot projects. A third administrator is a coffee shop owner in South Africa. The situation I'm afraid of is a situation where projects like this one pick up authentication and authorization from the shared models because it's easy. And then they discover that they have to create barriers to participation just because someone is living far away from anyone running this trust relationship. There's a coffee shop owner in South Africa who's not allowed to help.
Or there's a coffee shop owner in South Africa who lives a bit more dangerously because he's exposing his password to this unsecure box that's standing in the basement. Whereas the others are logging in using the secure faded login service or the secure shibboleth service and aren't exposing their password to this unsecure box he's running.
Or the coffee shop owner belongs to the Federation of Coffee Shop Owners and mom and pop identity service providers. There is another, we talk about banks, etc. There will be another fabric. The ones that will probably support the chaos will be in some loose federation, very loose federation. But as long as we keep the number scalable, we can apply kludges. It's, kludges don't scale, but if we keep the numbers low, we might be okay.
So you mean you can support 5 kludges, but not 500,000?
Yeah. You know that one well.
As long as you're within all your bases all belong to us, and you know the number of bases, you should be more or less okay. There's a question?
I was thinking the other way around. There's a large obstacle in using these systems because the end user doesn't trust such large databases at all. So you need to do something to the perception of those users. What do you think would help to overcome that obstacle? Because I think, honestly, there is not a lot you can do on it.
I think there's one simple answer. It's transparency. You tell the user what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. I've heard of Passport. A lot of people, when Microsoft came out with the idea, even without hearing what Microsoft was planning to do, they said immediately, we don't trust it. And that's not only because of the reputation of Microsoft, but it's a large institution that people, it's out of their grasp. It's beyond what they know, and they don't trust it because it's too far away from them.
One of the common denominators of the federations being built for authentication and authorization in higher education seems to be the fact that all the information about a user is kept by that user's university or college or other home institution. And if you don't trust your university to give you your login name and keep your password reasonably safe, you have a problem in the first place. Because we know what happens to systems that get broken into, but then again, at least the last 5 big break-ins we've seen in Norway has typically been some stupid service, normally a web server, installed on the server and you didn't know it was there. Some operating systems automatically installs a web server and an SQL server for you. Then you get into the system, you sniff for passwords, and since you're exposing passwords every time you log in instead of using a centralized login service, you have to protect the passwords from sniffing at each individual application. Then you get the password, you sniff until you get a sysadmin's password, and then you break into the user database. And if you want the details on how to change 52,326 passwords, you can talk to the man in the striped shirt over there.
That's no problem, I know about those things. But what you are telling me now is exactly what I'm trying to get, which point I'm trying to get along. What you're telling now is a long story, a quite detailed story on technique. Most users don't know it, don't understand it, don't want to know it. The only thing they know is there's a large entity over there, has a lot of information on me, and I can't trust it. And
well, when Michael had that trust diagram up earlier and David pointed out there was another trust flow. In fact, there's 4 trust flows in that diagram. One of the trust flows is that the user trusts their enterprise to release attributes appropriately. And we're going to make that part of the acceptable use statements that users sign. So
yeah, I think that's the better way. Yeah.
So we will do that, and you will say that you indemnify us if we happen to release your login name when we should just have released member
But
of
that
the
implies
community.
accountability.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's lots of trust in all this. We're trying to automate something, and it's ungodly and unnatural, and we're going to succeed.
Okay, thank you very much.
Walter, could you comment a bit on what the user's obligations are? The comment now was on what the institution's obligation, but the user also has certain obligations to the system.
Well, at least in public universities or colleges, of course, you have to hold the user responsible for doing some things to keep this secure. You have to hold the user accountable for example, maintaining his personal information. And the thing that these systems do is put everything in one database where the institution, as you've talked about, has to have a transparent policy, and they have to let the user say, this is all the information we have on you. And then the user has to comply with all the rules for using the system. And he also has to go in and check that, yes, this information is correct. And when both parties know what information is there and where it's going, perhaps that the users don't trust them, but I don't see how you can make the system better. Also, this is the best you can get.
Okay, maybe that's true. But there's a system over there with a lot of information on it. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I'm telling you that more than 50% of those systems probably will not be secured properly. And that's something that's really bothering me, because if you want to make those people trust you, you have to make a point of it that those systems are really up to date if it's concerning security. And most of those are not.
One comment I made to Ken's plenary presentation is that I think we are thinking much too binary about trust. The English language has this concept, I trust you, which is about as informative as I love you. Oh, probably less so. As subject to interpretation under various situations. I mean, I trust Ken enough that I'm willing to trust him with the information that I'm in Zagreb right now. And I also trust him enough that if he buys me a beer, I'll probably drink it. And similarly, I would trust the administrators of my bank system so much that I'm willing to tell them too that I'm in Zagreb and that I want money from that damn ATM machine in the wall. But that does not mean that I will trust the same organizations or the same persons with certain events of my past life that are better not revealed to anyone. No, I'm not going to tell you.
There are two trust relationships you're really talking about. The first is you trust that your enterprise is operated well enough that the attributes it stores for you and releases for you are secure, etc. If you don't trust them, don't sign the acceptable use because you're about to indemnify them. The second trust relationship is that you trust that the relying party that has passed the information is secure and does nothing inappropriate with that. That's another level of trust. Federations need to address that. We've gotten so far in our twisted thinking to think about how we could take a certificate policy and say, gee, relying party, you know, we already have placed one obligation on you. You need to check the CRL or OCSP before you use the certificate. We can place another obligation on you, which you'll never know about unless you read our CP, which is that you not mishandle the information, that you protect privacy, that your system is secure enough that that we can be confident that attributes won't leak out. We're thinking about doing that. We're thinking that that has to be it. When you start to think about a world with privacy, then you need to put a relying party clause into the certificate policy. Last thing that anybody who's struggled for 5 years on certificate policies wants to hear, Peter. But the idea is that the relying party has an obligation to not misuse the information that they receive.
I fear that people will always misuse whatever tools we build. Even if the systems are technologically perfect, they'll still be misused, either purposely or inadvertently. I'd like to give two examples recently. I recently registered for something on the web, which had a number of fields to enter in, some of which were mandatory. One of the mandatory fields was a mobile phone number. Now, I don't have a mobile phone. So I put in 0, and that was accepted. Now, I don't know why they were looking for a mobile phone number in the first place. They had my landline. But the fact is that they were looking for information which, even if I had a mobile phone, I would think twice about giving it to them. Secondly, I was easily able to misuse the form. So technology there doesn't work. Another example is I was in a bank recently exchanging currency, and they asked me for my passport. Now, this is perfectly reasonable. I know of several European countries where they will do the same thing, and banks, and I know of European countries where they won't ask for a passport. Now, I didn't have my passport with me, so the alternative on their behalf was to check the notes I proffered more carefully, and this seemed to be acceptable. I wonder how many people think it's reasonable for a bank to look for a passport when exchanging currency. Hands up? Reasonable? Not reasonable? Okay. Now, where it might be useful would be in a restaurant when I'm proffering a Visa card, which doesn't have any photo ID. And I've never been asked for a passport in a restaurant. How many people think that would be reasonable? 2, 3. There seem to be more people who would think it's reasonable for the restaurant to ask than for the bank. I wonder if anybody has any comments on whether we are building technology which can't reasonably be used properly anyway.
I have a small comment which applies to both your examples, and that is that the thing that should make both this website you were on and the bank do what they do is not how you build the system, it is whether or not that is allowed by the laws. And the entire society we live in enables you to do a lot of things that aren't allowed. You can steal things in real space, but you don't because it's illegal. And it's the same thing with taking information and misusing it. That's not something you should do. And if someone finds out, you're going to be punished. To the second thing, the bank, I think that is a very short answer to that is that you have this money laundering directive in the EU that says that banks have to make sure that you're not laundering money. Now, it only applies to currency and certain sums of money. So if you're in a restaurant buying a pizza for 50 kroners, £5 perhaps, I can understand why they haven't made them also check your passport.
They still changed the money.
They changed the money, yes.
Yeah, but it's a smaller amount. No, the bank was asking for my passport, but when I refused to give my passport, I said I didn't have it. I didn't have it. They accepted that. So they were looking for information to begin with that they didn't need. Either that or they're breaking their own money laundering.
No, they need information because they need the number of the bills. So if they have a case, if they're looking for something, they can say that we handed these bills out to this person. And you can't make rules very complicated. If you want to launder money, you do that in a bank. You don't do it when you're buying a pizza.
My point is that in that case, they broke their own rules. Right. They changed the money anyway.
There's a wide variety of rules, and they're different from country to country. For instance, in the European Union, if you're part of the Schengen Agreement, as a Norwegian, I'm allowed to go to the Netherlands without bringing my passport. The problem is the minute I'm in the Netherlands, I'm required to carry my passport with me at all times. So I can go to the Netherlands and then, without having it, but I need it once I'm there, and I needed to rent the hotel room and all kinds of stupid things. So there are stupid rules about information, and some of them are standardized, some are not.
I thought you identified two problems. One is that the world is inconsistent and doesn't play by its own rules, and that's certainly the case. Will this technology make it more consistent? Unlikely. Will it make it better? Most definitely not. So it goes. The second problem you identified, I believe, is one's about how users will approach this stuff and how will they learn about these technologies. And I would not overlook transparency, as Christoph said. I never thought my mother would learn how to do a backslash. We can imprint.
Hmm.
And another aspect to what you experienced, your business partners apparently were prepared to accept more risk in the end that they usually do. So they asked for more information, they settled on less. So they accepted the risk. It was a business decision on their side.
No, it's my turn, I think. I have a question or a comment about trust that was raised here earlier. I am also a full-time student at the University of Oslo, and I'm working at the University of Oslo. I don't think that the break-in we had has done anything with my trust to the University of Oslo's way of handling it, because then after that incident, I know that what they did, they changed all the password. They did a really quick job to secure everything. So I don't see how I not should trust them now as a student, because everybody could have a break-in. You can never be 100% secure of anything. Not in your house, not in your system. So I think nobody has lost the trust at the University of Oslo or the 4 other institutes that had their breaking. I think, Ingrid, can you comment on that?
I don't think that was exactly the issue. I think the issue was more a question of we're building big systems and the users these are new animals. The users don't know them, and they need to know them to be able to trust them. And another question that was implicit in the comments, the way I heard it, was the difference between is the fact that you need to trust the system that holds your information, an argument for or against building a centralized system. Because if it's centralized, it's easier to secure and you know where the information is. On the other hand, if you have a problem, you suddenly have a very big problem. So, there's another comment or question from the back.
Yeah. It seems to me that there are several different things going on. And since what's going to drive all of this has very little to do with technology and an awful lot to do with politics and power, I would like to talk about politics and power for a second and ask your opinions on these things. In the world we live today, we have a problem with not knowing who is doing what over the internet. And governments have decided that it's important to know who's doing what over the internet. And notwithstanding any of our desires for personal privacy, governments are instituting a who are you, not a waif, but a who are you. And if you don't tell me, and if I'm not confident enough in who you are, you ain't going to get in. And that's coming from the top down, and that's a power politics situation. Ken, the answer is that the entities responsible, I think, for promising or at least stating what they're going to do with your private information are the issuers of your electronic credentials. So if I get a digital certificate, for example, medium assurance level digital certificate from my government agency, they're going to tell me exactly what they will and will not do with that information. I can't, if I do not want to keep that job, then I will have to, I can move on. But if I want to keep the job that I have and keep getting paid this exorbitant salary, and keep getting paid to come to places like Zagreb, then I'm going to have to step up to the bar of having a much lower privacy quotient than I used to have. And that's because all of these structures that we have been working to build for the last 30 and 40 years now need to be protected. This means that we have much less privacy in our lives. And the reason, in fact, that the bank probably wanted to know who you were with a greater level of assurance was because they do have counterfeiting problems. And they do have money laundering problems, even for as much as 500 krona. A policy is a policy. Now, does that really have anything to do with you? No. It's nothing personal, which is kind of an ironic comment. It's that they have a problem, and you are affected by their problem. And there's nothing that we can do in the technology space. Oh, we can come up with grand schemas, and we do. I mean, you've heard them. I've heard them. You know, federation is just the latest iteration. Federation of identities is just the latest iteration of a mechanism for maintaining a pitiful level of privacy in our larger world. But the fact of the matter is that we have no control over where this thing is going because the entities that are responsible for this have a greater need to secure themselves.
Okay, so what you're saying is we're moving from the global town to the global village where everyone knows what you're doing all the time. I've lived in a village.
You may very well be right in that. And in a privacy context, the only counter weapon we have is not trying to keep this information from them, because I think you're right that we can't do that. But we can try and make the information correct. And if some unidentified government agency in another country was having a file on me, what I'm hoping for is not that it's empty, but that it's really me.
Speaking for an equipment vendor, or not speaking for, speaking from, who is occasionally in a situation where our customers say that we have to supply them with gear for government wiretapping, or they will not buy from us. I can sympathize with some of the problems. The right to privacy is relatively low on the scale of human rights, I think, compared to things like being allowed to stay alive. I did not make any comment about Iraq. I think it's one thing we can do in order to promote transparency about what privacy we're actually getting is to make sure we do these processes in the open. My company recently released specifications in the form of internet drafts for how you can tell a Cisco router in the next version, if you have paid us an exorbitant amount of money so we can pay all these unhappy programmers who had to make it, how you can make a Cisco router do wiretapping. Not any Cisco router, but specific Cisco routers where you bought the service. We believe that it was the right thing to release this information because people have a right to know which mechanisms are available in order to invade our privacy, so that we know what to expect. Other vendors have chosen to provide the same kind of interfaces, but keep the details of what service they provide secret. And I think that's a bigger erosion of privacy, or more dangerous one. So when we design large databases that collect information that the governments will know, companies might know, we ought to do it as publicly as we can.
I'm less concerned about governments, frankly, than about corporate entities.
Well, before you said that, I would have said, Peter, that I think the challenge is to take your world and the world that we want and try to make them coexist. And I think the solution lies, much as Harald said, is that you build systems that protect privacy and that could be abused by governments, and then you at least have a channel for knowing that you're being abused. As you and I know, when we talked to the U.S. government about things like Shibboleth, they kept on asking questions like, so what could we find out with a subpoena? And I think that's exactly the right approach, is you build systems that can be compromised by governments that want to do so, and you made privacy protection is built into the system. It can be then abused by governments or perhaps by corporations.
The concept of a right to privacy, at least in the U.S., is an implicit right. It is not an explicit right. Now, I'm not arguing whether this is good or bad. Please don't misunderstand me, because I'm not the representative of the great fascist state. I'm just a minion of the great fascist state.
You don't even know how to do that properly yet.
Yeah, I can min pretty good. The situation is that while there are statutory protections for certain kind of or certain kinds of privacy data, there is no explicit right to privacy, and that in fact your quote right to privacy may impinge upon my right to privacy. And so privacy is, as you all have said, is a brokered thing. One gives away or sells one's privacy for convenience or for service or for a job, as I mentioned before. And so when you talk about privacy, I think one has to be a lot more subtle. It is not, as an abstraction that operates both in the philosophical and legal realms, that's a much more complicated term than a discussion of implementation of privacy in technology would lead us to believe.
To the concept of a right to privacy, I'd just like to add that as Harald said, you can't really take it up there with the right to life, and it's fairly new. Privacy, as we know it, is about 100 years old, and it was someone thought of it in the US when they wrote a thesis called A Right to Privacy, and what drove them to do that was technology, because you suddenly got this horrific thing called newspapers that exposed social life in certain cities in the East Coast in a way that no one had ever experienced before. And given that, they said, well, perhaps we have a right to privacy. Now, 100 years later, technology changes again. You have a new infrastructure that you have to live with, and well, perhaps privacy will change again.
We need to sum up. Are there any final questions before I give the mic to each of the panel participants? No? Ken, please? Anything you want to say?
We are definitely handling powerful tools and powerful problems here, and it scares me a lot.
We have explored privacy, authentication, authorization, and discovered that none of these are simple concepts. It's not that strange that the software to implement concepts that we don't understand tends to be hard to understand. And I think that we need to stick to the academic sector's tradition of open discussion, open implementation. Let's stand behind what we have built. That's the only hope of getting it right.
And on the note of let's not get stopped by not understanding the problem space we're in, but let us be engineers and build useful services for our users and try and make the best for the environment we're in, I think we conclude the panel. Thank you to the participants, and thank you to all of you who asked questions or nodded or listened. Good night.